Hello, my name is Lucy Johnston. Today I have a very special guest on Collateral Global, Sir Graham Brady, who was chair of the very powerful committee of backbench Conservative MPs, the 1922 committee. Sir Graham, who's now in the Lords, was very influential in ending lockdown measures in 2021, and throughout the pandemic he was a vocal critic of some of the measures that were imposed. He tells me about his personal conversations with Boris Johnson, how Boris Johnson thought that COVID might wipe out the population and then decided it wouldn't, how he flip-flopped between policies, opened the schools and closed them again. And he also tells me how he believes society's problems today, including school truancies, mental health problems, as well as the black hole in public finances, are largely to do with COVID lockdowns. So, Graham, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your book, Kingmaker. Tell me a little bit just why you decided to write the book.
First of all, it's a great set of stories, and it's been a remarkable period of time in British politics. So much has happened, and I've had a unique perspective on it. So I guess I had a choice. I could either take all of this to the grave with me, or I could at some point publish it. And I think there's quite a lot that helps to correct wrong impressions, helps to set records straight, and so on. So I think it should be published. I've waited until after a general election. In fact, of course, the fact that the general election happened a bit sooner than most of us expected led to us bringing publication forward a little bit. It had been scheduled for November originally.
We're particularly interested in the period of the pandemic. And one of the things that we've had conversations, and you've said to me that you believe sort of many of the problems of today are linked to that period during the pandemic. Can you just explain a little bit what you mean by that and what kind of problems you're talking about?
Lucy, I think that if you look at the problems facing government today, most of them either started with the COVID response or at the very least have been greatly exacerbated by the COVID response. So you can look obviously at the public finances, where we borrowed £400 billion to keep people at home and help to sustain jobs and businesses over the period of repeated lockdowns. You can look at the National Health Service, where we have much longer waiting lists because so many routine treatments and diagnoses didn't happen during the pandemic, when all too often the NHS was dealing just with COVID. And there were a lot of doctors at the time who complained to me saying that they weren't able to do what they needed to do for patients with cancer or heart disease or other ailments. You can look at, perhaps most importantly, the plight of the nation's children and young people. And we've got both far higher levels of truancy and non-attendance at school than was the case before COVID. But we also have this massive increase in young people with mental health problems, and especially, most notably perhaps, a huge increase in people being treated for eating disorders. So almost every part of the country, every part of our lives, the COVID lockdowns have had a very significant negative effect.
But I mean, it could be argued that we didn't really know we had to do what we had to do. I mean, what was your role in government, and why did you feel that some of these measures weren't necessary? And when did you first start to question them?
You're absolutely right. When the first problems arose with COVID, we didn't know how bad it was. We didn't know how infectious it was. And it was not unreasonable to take quite an extreme approach to trying to suppress the spread of the virus. But within about 3 weeks of the first lockdown happening, there was some pretty good data starting to come back that showed that the levels of infection had started to fall before the lockdown. So we had data suggesting that, in fact, some of the earlier, much lighter measures, the hand washing, the encouragement of social distancing, and I think, frankly, just people being cautious in their own lives had started to have an effect. So at that point, we also knew that COVID, whilst it could be very serious for some people in some demographics, particularly older people if they had comorbidities, we knew that this wasn't something as serious as, say, Ebola virus. So I think it would have been reasonable, even at that point, the end of March into the beginning of April, to start some tentative opening up. Allowing outdoor markets to operate, for instance, was the obvious issue and thing that I raised first. It seemed to me bizarre that here in Altrincham, I could go to Tesco's and buy a bunch of flowers, but I couldn't go to Altrincham Market and buy a bunch of flowers outside because they'd been forced to close. So that was, I suppose, when I first started asking those questions. And then as time went on, we'd only just come out of the first lockdown when my area was put back into so-called additional restrictions, which was effectively another lockdown. And that happened in a very arbitrary way. There was no logic to it because we had lower levels of COVID than neighbouring local authority areas that were not put into additional restrictions. It was done for administrative convenience because some other parts of Greater Manchester had higher rates of COVID. So I then noticed through that summer of 2020, when the Borough of Trafford and my area of Altrincham and Sale were effectively locked down, we had, at the time that we were locked down, we had falling rates of COVID infection. And by the time in September those restrictions were lifted, we had rising rates of COVID infection. So it was pretty obvious that the restrictions that had been put in place didn't actually work. And nonetheless, we then ended up with repeated cycles of lockdown, tiers, additional restrictions. And we have to bear in mind, of course, that it was still going on by December 2021, nearly 2 years later on. And the government was just ready to do it all again over that Christmas. And it was only the fact that 100 mostly Conservative MPs voted against the government on its so-called Plan B restrictions that made the government think again. And the great lesson from that was that when they didn't introduce those restrictions that they planned, nothing happened. There was no spike in COVID. So this idea that the government had started just to lock the country down as a knee-jerk reaction in case something bad happened. But when we didn't lock it down, nothing happened.
Fantastic. That's really, really a good account. What I want to talk to you about now is your interactions with, it was mainly Boris Johnson at the time, and how, firstly, why it wasn't your role as chairman of the 1922 committee necessarily to question some of the COVID restrictions and to get into the science, in inverted commas, of that, but why you took it up as your role. And secondly, some of the kind of conversations you might have had with Mr. Johnson during that period, and what your thoughts were about that. So firstly, why did you sort of take it on board?
I was sure I probably had more opportunities to communicate with the Prime Minister because I was chairman of the 1922 committee, but fundamentally I was acting as a member of Parliament with a concern about what seemed to me to be a massive public policy error that was going on. And I'd seen that very close up in my own constituency, where it was very plain that restrictions didn't make any sense and they didn't work. And then I started to look more into more detail of the medical evidence, the evidence relating to the inefficacy of mask wearing, for instance. I'd taken good advice from some senior respiratory medics and others. So I'd started to get at least a very strong sense that what we were being told was being done because of something called the science was at the very least questionable, that there were alternative strands of thought, that there was evidence that different approaches might have been better. And also, particularly coming from the local experience in the constituency, seeing what happened when we went from the end of the first lockdown to very, very soon after that, into similar restrictions being imposed again, the damage that was being done in other aspects of life was very, very painfully obvious. And whether it be the effect of closing schools and forcing children to lose their education, whether it be the impact on some businesses or engineering business in the constituency, where they couldn't get their workers to go to work because people had been led to believe that that it was dangerous, which it almost certainly wasn't, because they were working in a big shed and there was lots of distancing and lots of sanitizing. But the company couldn't fulfill its order book and ended up going bust. And that was a loss of 800 jobs. Just a little tiny example, one of doubtless thousands across the country, showing the damage that was done by ill thought out restrictions when other approaches would have been more sensible.
And you did approach Boris on a number of occasions. So one occasion I think you've mentioned in your book possibly is when the was about schools, and you spoke to him about the need to open schools. Can you tell us what he said and what that was like?
It was a remarkable thing because he agreed with me, said that he was going to send children back to school because it was completely safe. And then the very next day, there was a further announcement that I think it was primary schools wouldn't reopen for several more months. So the lack of consistency in that decision-making process was all too apparent. And I think one of the other conversations that I had, the fact that the government had taken very early on during the pandemic to having the chief scientific officer, the chief medical officer in those press conferences, which at the outset that I think they thought gave cover. It was like having backup in the room, and it wasn't just a political decision. But then, as things went on, these individuals were not charged with balancing judgments. They were there only to talk about ways in which we might minimize the risk of COVID spreading. And nobody asked them, or nobody gave anybody else the task of making a balanced, rounded judgment, which would look at the massive collateral damage that would be done in every other sphere of life, including non-COVID health outcomes, including mental health outcomes. And it was all too obvious at the time that these things were going to be massive problems, but they weren't part of the decision-making process.
You had some other experiences with Boris Johnson where he would apparently flip-flop. I think one was with the closing of the airports, and you spoke to him about the potential impact of that, or the impact of that on job losses. And tell me his response.
I was talking about job losses that might happen at Manchester Airport, and he said, yes, you're right, it's terrible. I've got thousands of constituents who work at Heathrow Airport. It'll affect mine as well. Well, I didn't think that was really an answer. But also the occasion when I went to him asking for some of the more unjustifiable restrictions to be ended, most notably the 2-meter social distancing rule, for which there was virtually no scientific argument. And it was the thing that made so many things in normal life impossible. It required effectively the closure of schools. It made it impossible to run a profitable airline or train service. All of those things were damaged by it. But I found that Boris started off asking whether COVID was meant to wipe out the human race, and maybe it was going to be our Black Death. I then said, but it isn't the Black Death. And he then agreed with me. He said, no, you're right, it's not. That killed a third of the population of Europe. This is killing hardly anybody. And the chief whip at the time was in the room as well and said, well, except for the elderly, which Boris then said, not even then. He said, if you're 90 5, or I forget what age it was, but in your 90s, then you have a 97% chance of surviving. So he was, Boris Johnson is a very clever man. He was actually quite well informed about the facts of COVID, but was allowing these repeated lockdowns to happen, even though it was going to cause so many problems.
And do you know why?
I don't know why, but I also I think it's important to be fair and cut a little bit of slack. It was obviously a very difficult time. There were a lot of people asking for more restrictions, not least amongst them new Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who would have had far more damage done to daily life and to all the non-COVID aspects that I've talked about. So there was pressure for more lockdown. The government's communication strategy had been extraordinarily effective. They'd set about trying to raise levels of anxiety. That was all minuted in the SPI-B committee, the Behavioural Science Advisory Committee. It said, on the subject of mask wearing, it said wearing masks will serve to heighten the sense of public anxiety, which should increase compliance with restrictions. So it's a matter of deliberate policy to make people more anxious than they needed to be. And the response to that, of course, the public was then polled about lockdowns, and big majorities were saying, we love lockdown. We'd like to be told what to do all the time, please. Can you please keep us in our houses for many, many more months? So again, you had pressure on government from some quarters to do more, do worse, and you had a public response which said, this is really popular. And I suppose not that surprising that government would follow that course. And I would add, I suppose, the fact that Boris Johnson himself had a very serious brush with COVID and had been quite poorly. I suspect that knocked his confidence somewhat, because all of these policy responses just seemed to be so much against his natural instincts, which I always have expected to be to trust people to make decisions for themselves and to give them the best information possible.
You mentioned that, that period was put government under a huge amount of pressure and they had to watch the polls. Do you think there's an intrinsic problem in the current governmental systems, which mean that they can't make rational, long, society-based decisions because of pressure of news cycles, journalists, and even, other factors, vested interests?
It's very difficult. And, again, being fair to Boris Johnson and to the British government at the time, it was far from alone. The vast majority of governments around the world engaged in similar actions. And, thank heavens we've got some counterfactual examples. The Swedes, who followed Britain's pandemic plan, and it worked perfectly well. They kept their schools open almost entirely through the whole period, and they didn't impose lockdowns on the Swedish people. Examples of different states in the United States. Florida didn't lock down, didn't close schools. California did. Florida has got famously an older population than California has, but Florida's outcomes were much the same, possibly better than California's. So we luckily have got some real world examples and evidence that show that you didn't have to do what was done. But it was I hesitate to say prevailing wisdom because I don't think it was wise, but it was the prevailing policy prescription followed in many places around the world.
So there was an element of censorship around there. There were scientists here, which I know you were talking to, a range of scientists, weren't you? But you might mention some of the scientists you work with here in this country and elsewhere. But do you feel that the scientists that were questioning some of the policies were shut down? Do you think there's a concern over censorship or suppression of science?
It's a massive concern. And when you look at some of the the calibre of some of the individuals who were trying to raise concerns, it's even more remarkable. And I'm thinking of Professor Carl Hennigan, Professor Sunitra Gupta. These are top academics in their fields, but academics and physicians who understood the subject. And the response of a lot of the academic community was to say, no, we don't want to hear from you. Go away. And it's a very worrying mindset, which I think has crept into universities around the world. And is, I think, all part of the same corrosive thing that tries to stop freedom of speech. And surely universities above anywhere should be places where ideas can be challenged and evidence is then adduced. And we saw the opposite going on in many higher education institutions. And we're now living with the consequences. If given that Carl Hennigan is the professor of evidence-based medicine, you would have thought that he might have been the very first person that government would turn to say, please advise us on what the evidence would guide us to do. But instead, there was very little real attempt to challenge the consensus, and there was also very little involvement, if any, of respiratory physicians. And we were taking policy advice from people who had no relevant specialism.
Brilliant. Do you feel that there's a danger that this is the sort of pandemic playbook and that it could happen all over again if we have another virus, disease X, as I think scientists are working now on for vaccines, an unknown pathogen?
Inevitably, we will have another pandemic at some point. And I suppose one has got to bear in mind the possibility that there is something much more serious than COVID was. And as I said earlier, if COVID had been as serious as Ebola virus, then the extreme responses that we saw would have been justified. So you've got to check properly what the nature of a pandemic is, but then I do hope that the experience of last time would be one which would lead the public to be far more sceptical of what they're being told by government.
Okay, so final, just to wrap up. So much of this is in your book, Kingmaker, which is out. When is it out?
Kingmaker is out on the 26th of September.
26th of September. You were chair of the backbench MPs, and many of whom were alongside you, a sort of group that were questioning some of these policies. But how did it affect you?
It did concern me that, from my perspective, there was no time when it was more important for Parliament to be present and doing its duty of scrutinising government. Government was putting the most extreme restrictions on people's lives, freedoms, families that has ever happened. I was going to say in peacetime, but actually ever happened in this country. And yet there was also an effort to get rid of Parliament. There were members of Parliament were encouraged not to attend. There was an encouragement to just to zoom in on big screens that were put up in the chamber of the House of Commons. And it just isn't as effective. So there were only, I think, probably about 35 or 40 members of Parliament who made a point of attending throughout the whole period of the COVID restrictions. And others were active on the screens and doubtless writing letters to ministers and all of the rest. But it just seemed the oddest situation that we had all of this much of it was unjustified, much of it was unevidenced, sweeping restrictions being introduced, then extended, then withdrawn, then introduced again by ministers. And there was very little scrutiny of it, very little scrutiny by the then Labour opposition as well.
Yeah. And final question, do you think big tech, so Facebook, Twitter, some of these monopolies, do you think they had a role to play in the way things went?
I think there's a real danger when these big tech companies start to um, talk about suppressing certain strands of thought or evidence because they're trying to stop misinformation. Now, it's a very difficult balance to strike, and I think in the vaccine space would be a very interesting thing to look at because I'm not anti-vaccinations, but I thought very strongly that the danger to children and young people of taking the COVID vaccine was likely to be greater than the danger of catching COVID was for them. And that's a very important debate, and some area in which I think that government did absolutely the wrong thing by pressuring effectively people who were very young to have the vaccination. They said wrongly that it would stop the spread of COVID as well, and that was the justification for it. They said COVID may not present a particular danger to you, but that there were all those awful adverts saying, don't kill grandma. And it later emerged that the vaccine made no difference to whether you were going to spread COVID or not. And I think that those big tech social media companies suppressed quite a lot of the possible debate and discussion on that subject because they were conflating it with the wider point of whether people were anti-vax or not, and whether there was a genuine scientific consensus that said this is wrong. So I just think there's got to be a lot more nuance and a lot more subtlety in the way that those kind of attempts to moderate the content that goes out on social media and other platforms takes place.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. It's lovely to talk to you, and we will hopefully, be buying that book very soon. Okay, thank you. Okay, see you again.
Thanks, Lucy. Bye.